Good morning, everyone. We'll just kind of wait for everyone to arrive and start in just a couple minutes.
Well, as they're coming in, I'll go ahead and just start playing the music, if that's okay.
I love it. It's very relaxing. I'll start in like a minute. We still have people arriving. Hello, everybody. Well, I can go ahead and get started, Charissa. Oh, 1 minute. Okay, that's fine.
We can go ahead and get started now. That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Allie Weiss, and I'm from Amplify Education, and I'm joined today by Charissa Snyder, who is our literacy specialist at Amplify. Good morning. If you had attended the NHIDA conference back in October, you might remember Charissa speaking about the 5 shifts to a scientific reading curriculum, and we had such a large turnout. We had so much interest that we decided to just come together again. And today, Chris is going to talk about some of the guiding principles that you can apply in your classroom. So thanks for joining us today. We're all here to drive reading performance and growth and continue to inform ourselves. And so we thank you for being here today, because that's just really one step in your journey. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Charissa. And thanks again, everyone, for being here.
Yes, thank you so much, Miss Allie. So when I see in the chat from Kristen, and you also love Claire DeLune, so perfect. I am actually going to play this a little bit because it's going to be kind of interwoven in a spot throughout the presentation when we think about I'm gonna play it for a little bit and let you enjoy it for about a minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. That's okay for some folks who didn't get to hear it. Harbor, Maine. Perfect. So hopefully you kind of got a little piece of that, but I'm bringing this moment into you because hopefully as we're looking to build capacity as a teacher, as a learner, as a parent, maybe if you can in the chat, just describe where you're coming from, who are you, what is your role? I'm Charissa Snyder. I am coming to you from Colorado, where I just flew in from Kansas, where it was pretty gray and kind of rainy, and now it's just a little bit cold in my home state. But today I'm going to be walking through some of the key findings from cognitive research that can inform our classroom practice and just inform us a little bit more. I know that many of us are coming from different angles. We know a lot about the science of reading. We're just beginning the science of reading. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming and talking and being here and learning more about just the science of reading. So that's a little bit about me. I'm a former 1st and 2nd grade teacher, and it does just honor me, and it brings me great gratitude to come and speak to you and just bring awareness through the science of reading. I am both letters and Orton Gillingham trained, and in my experience as a classroom teacher is where I saw these great outcomes within the science of reading. So as we're looking at either instructional practices and guiding principles that we can start using throughout our district and our classrooms, in our schools, at home, to really elevate what is best for students. And this is one of my most recent books as we talk about literacy and we talk about reading in general. I think it's also important for us as adults to just share and talk about maybe some of our favorite books. And so this is one of mine. Kristen Hanna is a fantastic author. She's the author of The Four Winds, which is a historical fiction story of a woman who grew up during the Great Depression. And so she's also the author of The Nightingale, if you're interested in a little bit about her. But I want to know more about you. So in the chat, and I'll look at it, where are you coming from? I see that Kim, Bar Harbor in Maine. And where else are you coming from? And maybe your role. Are you a family member? Are you a parent? Are you a teacher? Are you a principal? Are you a curriculum director? Yes, welcome, Kim. We'll wait just a little bit in the chat to introduce yourself.
Oh, thanks, Kristen. Yes. Good to see you.
Yes, good morning. Grab some coffee. Tony, Kristen, Philadelphia area. Give you a couple more seconds. Good morning, Sarah from South Florida, literacy specialist.
Love it. Yes.
Well, welcome. And thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Jamie's from New London, New Hampshire.
Beautiful. All right, well, feel free to introduce yourself throughout. I'll go ahead and continue through. And as we can see that there has been a huge groundswell movement sweeping across the country for this topic of catalysts for changing, right? And so it really is an exciting time to make this shift into the science of reading, because everyone, we have parents, teachers, news reporters, journalists, authors, they're starting to dig into the reason behind our lack of progress as a nation to develop proficient readers. We can see from our most recent NAEP data, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, that we only have 33% of our students who are reading at proficiency. So whether it's the nation's report card or any of these other folks, everyone is really confirming that now more than ever is this time to embrace this call to action and to start making the shift into the science of reading and looking into implementing core literacy instruction that's grounded in this reading research. So I'm really excited to talk about some of the instructional practices. We can look at the principles in ways to describe what is the science of reading and what are ways that I can also start instituting some of these principles, or what are they? So maybe it's just reaffirming different things that I'm already doing. So I think that it's good to just level set on when we talk about the science of reading, Amplify as a thought leader in the space, I want to just kind of ground ourselves in what do we think, or what do we say or mean when we say the science of reading. So this definition comes from the Reading League in their guiding, their guide. And so what we can see is that, and you're more than welcome to read this, but the science of reading is vast interdisciplinary set of knowledge. The science of reading is not just one type of research, it is composed from a variety of different resources, such as speech and language pathologists, psychologists. And so it's bringing and conducting all of this research into one set location that extends even into cognitive fields and neuroscience. When you look at the science of reading in this definition, even specifically in that second paragraph, it mentions that research is not only about reading, but it's also writing. When we think about teaching reading and we have instruction for our kids, are we teaching reading and writing in tandem? So that way, when students are listening and they're speaking, they're connecting that sound into print, and then they're also showing what they know through their writing, either through that expressive language when they're speaking, and then expressively when they're beginning to write, and then they're spelling, using those foundational skills as they're starting to apply them. More importantly, this research is not new research. The word, the science of reading, I think has started to kind of uplift during COVID when we were listening to a lot of podcasts, but the actual research itself is not new. This has been going on for the past 50 years. And so we'll start to dig into some of this research and where these guiding principles kind of started to originate from. But if you're interested in looking at more information You would definitely, I would recommend going into the Reading League, looking at their work, checking out their website. If you are someone that you know is looking for a new curriculum and you don't yet have a rubric, they also have a rubric that you can use and bring it with your literacy committee as you're evaluating and making those decisions for your school. So now I want to shift our path to these instructional principles around the science of reading. So you can take these principles and apply them to some of your different instructional strategies that you're already doing, or maybe it's a great idea to start reevaluating your current curricula to understand what's missing. So I want to start with the first principle, and the principle is that science-based reading instruction is a matter of equity. So when we think about this, we want every student that walks into our doors on the first day of school deserves to have the kind of instruction that will help them become proficient readers. So in order to begin this journey, I believe that we should absolutely look at the systems in place to see where it's all starting. So when we think about equity for our kids, we think about what systems are in place for every single one of our students, all of them. So they can be successful and we have a healthy system in place. So this healthy system, I'm sure you've seen this before, it's known as MTSS, or our multi-tiered system of support. And what MTSS is, it's a system-wide process. It monitors the quality of teaching and learning through using student data. When we look at MTSS, it's a focus on two things. It's a focus on our students and that instruction being high quality instruction based from this reading research. MTSS is also that process that supports our students in gaining the skills that they need in order to move them out of risk of some of these different categories. So when we think about MTSS, or our multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS and this model here is coming from the Center for Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. So you're more than welcome to, I could follow up with this website, or just if you're Googling it, that way you have it. But when we think about MTSS, it has three main components. And so these three main components, which we'll get into and you kind of saw on the previous screen, is all grounded in that foundation of data decision making. So you are constantly having collaborative conversations, you're looking at master schedules. And so the first thing that we want to do is to ensure that we have equity for our kids is beginning to screen them. We want to screen all of our students using universal screening to see who's at risk of not meeting these end of the year benchmarks. So we can provide targeted instruction through our tiered systems of support. And once we've identified each of these students who need either just the core instruction, or maybe they need tiered supports, whether it is strategic tiered supports, or we're looking at intensive tiered supports, from there, we can pull them into small groups, and we want to progress monitor those students. We want to keep an eye on them and constantly check to see how is this intervention, is it providing great outcomes for our students? And so then having progress monitoring, ongoing progress monitoring, to see how are these students doing? Is the instruction working? Do we need to look back at our tier 1 instruction? So really having this healthy system in place is equity. We are constantly checking the pulse of our kids with systems that are in place. These systems beginning at a district level, going into just some of the different schools, those schools going into different classrooms. So using screeners to check early literacy skills, using high quality instructional materials at the core level, as well as intervention services where it's pulling based on some of these different skill sets, I think is just a healthy place to start, because having these systems in place, knowing that when you go to a school or when you're making these data decisions and you're looking at a new curriculum, it's looking at the full picture. So I begin with just MTSS and going into that second principle as everything is really designed around a full system, or that healthy ecosystem. So the second principle is learning to read proficiently in any language requires both word recognition and language comprehension. So we know that whether in English or in other languages, you still have to be able to lift words off of a page. You have to be able to decode them and construct and extract information or meaning from those words or from the letters that you see on a page. So when we think about this, and I know that you've probably seen this 100 times before, but it's really important to start with the simple view of reading, because this model from Goff and Tumner has tried to be disproved over and over again, and they cannot disprove it. They can only prove that the simple view of reading works. And so this analytical work, more commonly referred to as the simple view of reading, was established in the 1980s from, as I kind of mentioned before, Goff and Tumner, where they show us a really simple way of understanding the complexities it is to read. We know that reading is very multifaceted. You're doing many things at once when you are reading. Many things are going on in your brain, but this kind of helps level set the cognitive capacities needed in order to read, but not necessarily the processes. When we think about the processes of reading, we might turn to a different framework, which would be the reading rope from Dr. Hollis Scarborough. But kind of level setting in when we think about just high quality instruction in general, high quality instruction should also be placing an equal emphasis on both of these two factors, looking at both word recognition. Students have to be able to lift those words off of a page and decode. And at that same exact time, once they're doing that, are they creating meaning from that? Are they constructing and extracting information, whether it's done orally or as they are starting to read this? Understanding the simple view of reading also from an instructional level can also help us when we are looking at that MTSS model, when we are using universal screeners. So thinking about how can understanding the simple view of reading help me as a classroom teacher as I am assessing students in my respected grade levels. So let's dig a little bit deeper into both of these factors. So language comprehension, on that top part of the strand, if you're thinking also of Dr. Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. So language comprehension is developed through knowledge building. And the way that you would want to do this is through a variety of different topics so that students acquire just a wide range of vocabulary and verbal reasoning skills. Understanding how language functions helps them make meaning from the text. And this enables students to make connections and then just ultimately determine the gist of the text, or just figure out what am I reading about. All while they're still building a deeper understanding of knowledge on these wide varieties of different subjects. So when we think about what's happening in the brain, we can see that language comprehension is something that is just wired from us from the get-go. As babies, we immediately understand language. Unless you have some sort of auditory processing issue, we continue to build that language and internalize it. I know certainly when I was going through my master's program, there's just new vocabulary coming in and it's building my own vocabulary. When I learn a new sport, like tennis, for example, I'm using language like love 15, love 30. Like I had no idea what that was. And so you're constantly building on that language, and language comprehension is going to be forever evolving based on what you know, what the environment that you're in, the books that you're reading. And so when we think about this, and we're thinking about vocabulary and constructing sentences into verbal reasoning skills, this is something that will just continue to build. And for students, and we think about our bright-eyed, bushy-tailed students who are coming into us every single day, or maybe your own child, we know that kids can be set at a disadvantage because they don't all have the same background. They all don't have the same vocabulary. So ways that we can start building this competency of language comprehension is going to be through different read alouds, which we'll look at here pretty soon. When we think about the other factors, such as word recognition, we also want to be able to give kids the keys, essentially, into unlocking this way into reading, so that way they can start to unlock this code. So word recognition is the ability to lift words off of a page or in the text, to recognize these words correctly. And in order to develop word recognition, you must be able to understand the language is made up from sounds, and then understand and connect those sounds to their symbolic representations or letters when we're represented that are on paper. So when you're able to become so automatic in this, and it becomes effortless, then we have decoding. So unlike language comprehension, like the slide before, word recognition is not developed naturally. So I show this visual because here is what's happening in our brain. We have our visual into our visual form area, and this is not connected into our meaning in our speech area. This is where providing explicit instruction, and why, especially in our foundational years for primary teachers, it is so difficult to teach students how to read, because we are literally reconnecting these pathways in their brains to turn a non-reading brain into a reading brain. So important things are happening there. Looking into that third principle, reading in any language is not natural, and it must be systematically, be taught systematically and explicitly. So what we know is when we're born, we have some innate abilities, while other abilities can only be developed through the process of learning. So they require this explicit instruction and some deliberate practice. So let me show you. When there are some abilities that are just kind of like preloaded and are enabled for our survival, right? And so look at these two pictures. Crying when you need something. I certainly was at a crying phase almost this week when I lost my credit card, but I digress. But as babies, we cry when we need something, right? Or when we're tired, we sleep to give our bodies rest and to continue to grow. We also understand that there are some abilities that are just not innate and can only be developed through the process of learning. These abilities require explicit instruction and deliberate practice over and over again. Learning how to swim, for example, would be pretty difficult after just simply watching a skilled swimmer in the water. Nobody just watches the Olympics with their family and then you throw a student into a pool. That wouldn't be very good. Or in the beginning of this video, in the seminar, you heard that piano music as you joined today. And so if there, and I know that I think it was Kristen who recognized who it was, but is there anyone who feels confident in trying to play a bit of what you heard earlier today? If you are either fluent or maybe skillfully playing some of the different music. Don't worry, I have the sheet if you want to play for us. And it's okay, I typically don't get volunteers to do this, but I'm a product of this era in education when we thought exposing kids to high quality literature would be more than enough to get them reading. And it seems obvious that when we think about this leap and it relates to music or advancements in neuroscience that has helped us to better understand how the brain learns and exactly what is required when we think about reading. So the idea that lines and these curves on a page, they convey meaning in a fraction of a second is truly astonishing. So for this to happen, we're going to go back to our brain picture because it lies in our visual zone of the brain and the spoken language zone right there in the middle. So what we see here is going to be what we call a critical switchboard, or those circuits. But no one is born with this circuit board or pathway that connects this vision and speech. That has to happen with vital connection that automatically enables reading. So that switchboard, we know it just doesn't naturally exist. And we're going to call this visual form area. And if you have it, then you can read. And if you don't have it, you cannot. So when we think about word recognition, it really is all about developing this little pathway for our visual word area so that the brain has the ability to transfer these written words, the text, into speech, whether it is spoken or it's not spoken. And the absence of this visual word form area is what makes learning to decode a word an unnatural process. And this is why we have to use then explicit systematic instruction, looking at phonological awareness and phonics instruction to develop skilled decoders. And so when we think about, well, what's the best way to do that? What does that look like in the classroom? we would want to do that through structured literacy. As we know, as we've evolved 50,000 years ago, language and just being able to speak, that comes natural to us. And so even beginning with speaking, such as within phonology, going into phonological and phonemic awareness, where kids are just listening to rhymes or just have them count how many sounds that they hear, moving it into just our reading continuum with how many sounds did you hear in this word? Let's play with the sounds at the initial sound, medial sounds, final sounds. We also want to look at different sound syllable associations. So being able to identify just the different sound, the sound to spelling relationship, because in the English language, we have 44 sounds. And out of those 44 sounds, we have approximately 150 different sound spellings. So being able to introduce the most common and least ambiguous sound spelling, and then continuing to add into it so we can get fluent readers. Looking at syllables, morphology, different parts of a word, syntax, so breaking apart different sentences and then creating meaning from those sentences, maybe in language dives. And so this actually does come from the International Dyslexia Association, where I got this graphic. As we're looking at building structured literacy, back again into that MTSS model. What are we using at the forefront for our students? Going into principle 4, where we have to also shift from just looking at decoding, because remember, placing that equal emphasis is just as important. So looking at background knowledge and vocabulary, they are just as critical to comprehension as decoding. So when we think about this and how this has traditionally been done for decades, we try, and myself included, have tried to teach comprehension as a set of skills. So an example might be, let's find the main idea or make predictions, and we're going to use selected texts to find this main idea, or a text where it is pretty predictive. And what we see is that these skills, they don't transfer if students don't have background knowledge, and if they don't have specific vocabulary necessary to make the meaning from these texts so that they can begin reading it. We understand, and Natalie Wexler in The Knowledge Gap is a really great book, but she also just talks about how this approach hasn't been working. And I'm sure many of you think about a kiddo who seems to understand this strategy. We've taught it for a week and we've assessed it. And then when we get to these high stakes tests, or you're giving them some sort of screener, we see that that skill is not transferring. So I'm going to show you research that you might be familiar with. This is the baseball study, and they created a replica of a baseball field. They asked about 62 12-year-old students to read this passage, narrating half of the inning of a fictional game. Students that were asked to recreate the action based on this text. So what they found is, in order to analyze the data, they put students into 4 groups, just like you see right here. And based on their ability into reading and their knowledge of baseball. Okay, so if you aren't familiar with this research, make a prediction on how many students performed on this reading comprehension task. So what impact of knowledge did the game of baseball have on students' ability to understand the text? Do you think kids who could read really well, they understood the baseball, or do you think students who maybe weren't as skillfully decoders, but they knew a lot about baseball, did better? I'll give you just a little bit. I'll push forward too, and I'll show you. So here are the results, just in case you were wondering. So, and I'll show you here, let me skip back. So students that knew a lot about baseball, they performed a little bit better. So students with that low reading ability put a high level of background knowledge, outperformed students with a high reading ability, but a low background knowledge by a lot. So background knowledge is critical when we're thinking about reading comprehension. everyone has many different levels. We all have many different reading levels, just depending on our background knowledge of a topic. So cognitive neuroscience research, that approach of education. So within this framework, I have significant academic knowledge and domain-specific vocabulary that I will have a high level of motivation to puzzle through some of these different ideas and kind of figure out how to connect what I already know. But just neuroradiology, I don't know if I know much about that, so I might struggle through that. I may know just as much as a second grader. But if you give me a good summer beach read, it's pretty easy for me to understand. I could probably understand this book while I'm cooking dinner or playing a game on my phone, quizzing my sister with her college or anything, while keeping the dog away at the same exact time. And our students, they are the exact same. Our students are the same. If we box them into a just right reading level, we're really limiting their exposure to these texts that follow their interest in knowledge base. Readers begin to find texts difficult when just about 2% of the vocabulary is unfamiliar. And when we think about just looking at some of these different texts and we're looking at leveling them, like in the different levels that you see here, it is just kind of confining them. So how do we start building background knowledge across content areas? This shows the average number of minutes per day of instructional time in each of these different content areas. We aren't sufficiently building background knowledge in science and social studies because we have focused so heavily on reading and math. And so for this reason, we need to be intentional about designing the literacy block to include sets of specific knowledge building and knowledge domains that build on the complexity and deepen our students' understanding and vocabulary about and around a topic. So how do we do that? Read alouds. Read alouds provide students with a model where it models advanced grammar, syntax, vocabulary, text complexity. So when we use text sets that build this network of knowledge and vocabulary, we're giving students this opportunity to retrain new knowledge, and let's retain it and let's apply it and explicitly connect it to what we already know, our prior knowledge. So when we think about read alouds and thinking about when do we start having these different read alouds, like in our primary grade levels, this research, and I showed it, I believe, in the last webinar, but when we look at how do we build knowledge for our students, and we talk about these read alouds from T.G. Stitch's research that you can find in the Reading Rockets website if you're not familiar with it. So this research helps us understand that listening comprehension outpaces reading comprehension, and it catches up at the age of 13. So really, this gives us insight onto how we can develop students' oral language in an equitable and age-appropriate way, especially in those early years, spending tremendous energy on decoding and lifting words off of a page. Let's just build this through listening, right? Through daily read alouds, because it can eliminate that cognitive lift for kids. We're giving them more space when they're not having to figure out and decode these words. And we can really capitalize on listening comprehension to build rich knowledge for students and vocabulary during this in our core instruction. So that way all students have access to build background knowledge and content knowledge and vocabulary. And when we think about students in our upper elementary years, like in third or fourth or fifth grade, when students are becoming more skilled decoders, it's important for them to start unpacking more complex texts that they're learning during that time in reading. And so when we think about this again, kind of to summarize, is just expose kids into reading. If you have a young student or a young child, you have someone who is just had a baby, commentary, everything for them. because we know that from research, students who come from a reluctant versus a talkative household, kids who are coming from a talkative household, they're just building language a little bit quicker. And so that would be my one recommendation, amongst other things, is just talk to your kids on a regular basis. Looking at the fifth principle, when we're looking at foundational skills instruction, it must be systematic, building from the more simpler to more complex. It must be explicit and engaging, using different modalities and senses. So we know through research, and if any of you on the call are familiar with Orton Gillingham, where they use just multisensory learning, we know that there's a lot of sensors in our brain, and we want to get our learning from our working memory into our long-term memory. So let's use different modalities. Let's use visual, let's use kinesthetic, let's use auditory. So when we're thinking about that bottom part of the strand, building a strong foundational skill, we want to first start within phonological awareness. And we want to start building this through being both explicit where it's clearly defined, stating it, leaving no doubt in relation to what it looks like in the classroom. We want to just direct that instruction, explicitly modeling, telling students that the t sound in today is represented by the T, and not really leaving it for discovery, right? And so Dr. Anita Archer has a lot of research in just being explicit and how this is super important for students who are novice readers or struggling readers, because if we just surrounded them with books, then we would have all of our kids would be on benchmark. As well as we want to be systematic. We want to follow a continuum, maybe using something like structured literacy, going from more easier to more complex skills. And we're slowly introducing these skills to build on what we already know, or what's already known for students. This, when we're being systematic, it makes new learning more obvious for kids and easier for students to connect what's familiar and then review what's known and continue that cycle of repetition, so kids can start to internalize these skills. So they can experience success, and we know that success breeds success. So it's really moving them towards this level of mastery. We also talked about beginning first within phonological awareness, developing phonological awareness. And we can really leverage the work of the brain and what made sense of the spoken language by building and scaffolding that welcomes the mapping from letters into sounds. So when students encounter a letter of the week approach versus a sounds first approach, we're placing a burden on their working memory. They have to hold it in their working memory and shape the letter and the name of the letter, and then the sound that that letter makes. At the highest level of phonological awareness is hearing that stream of spoken words, and to recognize that this language, like I'm wearing my sunglasses, and then we really hone in and recognize and isolate those individual sounds into, like, first you're starting within phonological awareness. So maybe they're just counting the words that they hear. I'm wearing my sunglasses. Next, we're going to learn that some words can be broken down into two separate words, like sunglasses, right? And then we learn to listen to that syllable level, sunglasses, as well as when we start to isolate these individual sounds within words like s, n, and so you see when we're breaking apart that sound. So all of this is should be done in that way. So that way it goes into our working memory as we're shaping the letters, the shapes, and in the name. So Dr. Carolyn Strum, she has such a fantastic webinar. If you don't know her, I would write her name down. If you ever have an opportunity to watch something with her, I would highly recommend it. She's an early literacy expert and a professor at NYU, and her mission essentially is to bring this cognitive science research to teachers and families through storytelling, because when we talk about just neuroscience, it gets kind of complex. So she really breaks it down for us. And so I would highly recommend listening to her and watching just the neuroscience and the connections in the brain. Because when we're teaching students how to read, we know that reading is opaque, it's complex, it's filled with many exceptions and rules, and we know this. English is one of the most complex alphabetic languages in the world, because there are more than 150 different sound spellings for the 44 different phonemes in the English language. So by comparison, the Finnish language has one spelling for one sound, no exceptions. And if you don't believe me, I'll quite defend my view with this brief sentence, because words don't lie, my friends. Let's see. Oh, let's go right here. If you don't believe me, we can see I'll quite defend my view with this brief sentence. And so we can see even that there's so many different exceptions. And so when we think about building language for our students using a solid core instruction, looking at foundational skills, it should be going from explicit instruction using a systematic framework. Now going into number 6, when we look at universal screening and progress monitoring for our kids, the most common types of universal screeners, we typically call them curriculum-based measures, or CBM. And these are screeners that are individually administered. So let's first look at just universal screening, level set on what it is and why we might use that. Because this too is when we think about, that's the MTSS, looking at the guiding principles. The purpose of the universal screener is you want to make sure that it's compared to a benchmark score, a level to determine by collecting data of a large group of students that are reflective on just national demographics. Universal screeners are indicators at one point in time that are to predict later reading success. So this entire decision, when we're looking at are students at risk of not meeting these end of the year benchmarks. So using a universal screener for this example, I can look and say, well, if I'm looking at the core instruction, is the core instruction working for this particular class in kindergarten? In the beginning of the year, we had 30% that were at risk of not meeting the end of the year benchmark. In the middle of the year, we were at 8%, whereas the end of the year, we're at 2%. So by using a universal screener, the core instruction is working pretty good. And so we can see that. So looking at this, and this really helps us in our tiered systems of support. The next thing that we want to talk about and look at is progress monitoring. So we want to progress monitor frequent. You want to do it frequently, ongoing assessments. And the purpose of this is to progress monitor who are at risk, the students who are at risk of that end of the year benchmark. And so we want to document changes in these student outcomes and measure and have a goal. And we're going to measure this goal and see how students are growing from this goal. What are we going to do next? Did it work? Has that student mastered this specific skill? Can the student exit this group? So this really helps streamline, again, what's going on within that student that we've now identified. When we progress monitor, similar to when you are, I don't know, training for like a marathon, or you're trying to lose weight, right? Lose pounds or inches. When you continue to weigh yourself or you time yourself every single time, it's slow moving, and that's okay because it takes time. It's very similar to when you are monitoring students' progress in reading. So when you are progress monitoring, most schools progress monitor every like 2 or 3 weeks with a more frequent assessment for students who are, again, not making consistent progress. And so the course of corrections that are a part of an intervention journey require a cycle of teaching, testing, regrouping, teaching some more, assessing again, and so on. So we can see that this is just continuing. This is a habitual cycle for students, and it again begins in that MTSS model. So when we bring all of our principles together using high quality instructional materials, we start to close these gaps by being preventative. Our systems and RTI models should also resemble this as well. So when we look at, we have a universal screener in place, we now want to look at our tiered systems of support. It's commonly referred to as RTI, where RTI and MTSS. RTI is a part of MTSS, but they also differ. So this is putting into place, one, having high quality instructional material, using that around that science of reading, because we want to be preventative versus spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in intervention. Let's get it right the first time. When we're looking at that RTI and we have an inverted or an upside down triangle, and all of our kids are either in that tier 2 or tier 3, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what's happening in core instruction? What am I using for universal screeners? So maybe it's a yes and, right? And so in that tier 1, being preventative, looking at what are we doing in the core instruction? Core instruction is for all of our kids. When we're looking at that tier 2, we've given some universal screeners. Now let's provide some strategic interventions. What skills do my students have? What skills do they not have? And what do they need in order to get those skills, right? So specific learning. As well as when we're looking at intensive intervention, we've used our universal screeners. We've had ongoing progress monitoring. Now let's bring some of these students into the forefront of our conversations, in our data team conversations, and now maybe looking at something like dyslexia, right? We have dyslexia screeners, or looking at even a phonological process or a language process where students can't just construct sentences. And so now let's provide some intensive intervention based off of our universal screeners. We would want to pull students who are high risk students again to really remediate some of these different skills that they have, but just remembering as well that we still want to provide students at the same exact time that any of this is happening, you're still giving students core instruction. Because if we take them out of the core, then we're having to play catch up and we're leveling them down, and we don't want to do that. They still are getting core instruction and getting the personalized instruction that they need, so that way we can start scaffolding it up back into that core instruction. So when we think about this and going into what Amplify has combined these critical elements in an early literacy suite where we're looking at curriculum and assessment, looking at those early literacy indicators such as phonological phonemic awareness, decoding. We do that through nonsense word reading, and then also looking at different personalized instruction. So these programs where you're looking at that MTSS, and it's that ongoing set, it's around data instruction, and ensuring that all educators and all folks really have the support that they need for their students. And everything is based and aligned with this system-based approach and looking at different effective processes and practices. So as we're summarizing and looking back on our learning and our journey into these guiding principles, first starting with having equity for our kids and having instruction that's science-based, but going into our MTSS, our multi-tiered systems of support. Knowing that language in any language, that reading in any language, it requires 2 factors. You have to have both word recognition and language comprehension. And knowing that reading in itself is something that just doesn't happen naturally for us. It's not hardwired in any way. That is something that has to be explicitly taught. And we want to do that through systematic instruction like structured literacy. We also know on the opposite end that we want to continue to build background knowledge and vocabulary, because that has a strong connection into how we're learning, right? And so that goes into that baseball study. And when we're thinking about these foundational skills for kids, again, being systematic, using different multisensory learning. So whether it's air writing or kids, I know one of the things I actually like to recommend to family members when I was a teacher is if you have a student and you know the teacher gave you some skills or something to work on at home, if you have a plate, like a paper plate, and if you dump in Jell-O in the paper plate and like mix in some sugar because it's like sour, and you say the sound and the student has to create the letter into that sound or the representation for that sound. And if they get it right, they get to lick their finger. And that was something that my kids loved, that they did at home and they loved to do. If you don't want the mess of the Jell-O, just having sand is also something that they can do, but like obviously don't have them lick their finger. That wouldn't be good. And then as well as having universal screening, doing that in the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year, in between those benchmarks. We want to have ongoing progress monitoring for the students who have been identified at risk of not meeting these end of the year benchmarks. So students who need either strategic or intensive supports, as well as just capitalizing on being preventative the first time. So when we look at number 7 in particular, when we're thinking about just having a solid core instruction, so that way it reduces the need for this intervention, right? And so having this science-based instruction, and it kind of ties back into that first one where it is that equity piece. So here's just a little bit of information into our early literacy suite. If you're wanting to learn more about the podcast or just the science behind it, Susan Lambert is fantastic. She interviews a variety of different people. One of my most favorite is going to be with Brooke and Mitchell's. Fantastic. It talks about the implementation. These principles can be found on this QR code as it's just written. I've kind of reorganized them in a couple of different throughout this presentation. So if you're looking at it, I just moved them around a little. So I'll give you a couple seconds to look at that QR code and get it. And then you can pause the video as well afterward and take a snapshot. And then thank you so much for your time. And if you want to reach out more and you want to just have this again or just provide feedback, because we always want to know that, definitely get this QR code or reach out to Miss Allie Weiss. And we would love to continue this conversation. Enjoy the rest of your wonderful Fridays. Have a great weekend. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We have about 9 minutes left. So I want to give you back some of that time, but also stay on if you have additional questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Charissa. Yeah, please, if there's any questions, we have some time if you want to put them in the chat. Otherwise, there's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me. We really appreciate you coming today and listening to Charissa to really, deepen and broaden your knowledge on the simple view of reading. And then, of course, we probably will end up having additional webinars in the future. So we'll just keep you updated about that. So thanks again, Charissa, for providing these principles today. And again, you can access the QR code and take those with you. And thanks again, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much.
Have a great weekend. Oh, okay. Kim had asked if we're going to be doing any professional development around the application of these principles in the classroom. If you reach out to me, Kim, I can definitely talk to you about some opportunities that we have.
Absolutely.
Yep, I'll put it in the chat too.
And I'll put it on the screen. I'll put it back on the screen. Right here.
Thanks, Kim.
Bye, Kim. Thank you so much. Thanks, Kristen and Jamie, Sarah.